Hey, what you reading for?
Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk about books, literary, horror classics, and contemporary. 2023 was a very good year for me as a reader. And it was full of pleasant surprises that I want to share with you. I've read 84 books this year, of which 55 were from writers that I experienced for the first time. So some of those surprises are these great writers that I can't believe I hadn't read before, but now that I have, I definitely need to follow up on them in 2024. If you are new to this channel, thank you for stopping by. I hope you enjoy the content, and I do hope that you consider subscribing. I appreciate the support. We'll start things off with a short intro sequence featuring the music of one of my favorite composers, John Adams, and I'll see you on the other side to talk books. Going through my reads chronologically, my first big pleasant surprise came from White Teeth by Zadie Smith. This book came out in 2000 and it was super hyped. In fact, The Guardian called it the most hyped book of the 21st century. And everybody was talking about it, everybody was loving it, and that's what's kept me away from it for so long. The hipster in me said, well, if everybody's going to like it, then I'm not going to read it, right? But actually, there's also a fear. I don't know if you have this experience, but if there's something that everybody likes, everybody loves, I'm afraid, for a book, for example, I'm afraid to read it because what if I don't like it? Is that more confirmation of how out of touch I am with everyone? And so I feel this pressure and this fear to be revealed to me how much of a freak I am, right? I can't enjoy what other people enjoy. So I stayed away from that book for so long for those two reasons, really. But back in January, I had a moment of courage. And I said to myself, Michael, don't be afraid. It's time. It's time that you read White Teeth. And I did, and I loved it. I was very impressed. So it turns out I'm not that disconnected from everyone. I was able to enjoy something that a lot of other people enjoyed too. I was very impressed. This was her debut book, and I have to read more from her. And it turns out that she came out with a new book quite recently called The Fraud, which I am definitely going to check out in 2024, and most likely very early in 2024. My second big surprise came a few weeks later, perhaps a week later, and with another book that came out in 2000, and that was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Now, I hesitated reading this book for much the same reasons as I hesitated reading White Teeth. And also, I had heard that this book was quite gimmicky. Like you had to read it upside down and put it in front of a mirror sometimes. And I thought, oh, that seems kind of gimmicky. I want a serious novel from a serious writer. It doesn't sound serious, right? So I didn't read it. But finally, also I was intimidated by the size. Depending on the edition, the one I got was like 700 pages. So I was a little bit intimidated by it. But I had another one of my moments of courage, and I said, okay, just let's see what all the hype's about, right? And yeah, I was blown away by this book. Blown away by this book. It is essentially a manuscript that was dictated by a blind man to his to a bunch of random people, and then he goes back through the manuscript and makes some footnotes, and then years later, someone else finds the manuscript, this drug addict, right? And so he reads the manuscript and he makes notes in the margins, and then he also tells his own story about his experience reading this manuscript and about what's going on in his life. And the manuscript itself is about a family who they move into a house, and the house suddenly, and in the house there suddenly appears a seemingly never-ending hallway. It just comes out of nowhere, and the husband goes to explore this hallway. But we don't get the account from the family. We get the account from documentary filmmakers and really other people in society who are commenting on the film and commenting on the story. So the book is a labyrinth in itself, with comments, looking at comments about a documentary about something that was dictated and then footnoted. The way it is formatted is in a labyrinth, and the book is about a house which has a labyrinth in it, which all might just be the story of a relationship which is a labyrinth. It's just a fascinating way to construct a novel, and there are passages in it that are very funny, passages that are poetic, beautiful, and there are passages that are legit scary. So this goes up immediately high on my list of best books for me that I've experienced, and that was a big surprise. Then early in April, I had another moment where I shed my stubbornness for a moment and had another fantastic surprise, and that was from a book that came out in 1979 that I definitely should have read decades ago, and that is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. So many people, friends and people I respect, had been telling me to read this book. Michael, you have to read this book. You're going to love it. And I would always say the same thing. I would say, okay, I don't read science fiction, right? And they're like, okay, fine. Don't read science fiction, but read this book. Eventually, their persistence paid off, and I broke down and read it. And boy, did I love it. It is light and fast and fun and funny, and it provided a great break, a change of pace for me. I tend to read a lot of either heavy literary works or dark, twisted horror, and this was just a completely different experience. And this book is part of a series. There are 5 in the series. I only read the first one. I wanted to keep reading, but I figure this is such a great change of pace for me that I'm going to keep these other 4 volumes for later when I need a break, when I'm into the horror and into the darkness, and I just need a change of pace. I've got 4 aces, or 4 palate cleansers, if you will, in my back pocket. So I am definitely looking forward to using one of those palate cleansers probably pretty soon. But I'm looking forward to reading more from Douglas Adams in 2024. Another surprise for me was Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now, I went into this read completely blind. It won the Women's Prize for Fiction, and generally books that win that prize or even are nominated for that prize, they tend to work very well on me as a reader. So I will often just go blind into a book that's won or been nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction. So I knew nothing about Madeline Miller. I knew nothing about this book when I got it, and I loved it. 5 stars for me. It's a beautiful story about 2 boys. They start off as friends, and then as they grow older, they become lovers, and then they go off to war. So there's heroism and there's tragedy. Spectacular writing. Now, she has another book, which also won the Women's Prize for Fiction, and that is Circe. So I wanted to read that immediately after reading Song of Achilles, but I stopped myself because I think she puts so much effort and time into her books, and she does a lot of research because they're historical fiction, that it takes her several years to put out a book. And Circe is her only other book. So if I were to read it, then I would have no other Madeline Miller book to read. And I don't want to live in a world where I don't have another Madeline Miller book to read. So I'm quite nervous about reading that book. And so I've been putting it off. But I'm not going to be able to wait much longer. I think I'm going to read Circe early 2024. Another blind read that really surprised me was back in August. I read Valley of the Dolls by Jaqueline Susann, a book from 1966. And I knew nothing about this book. I knew that it was a big hit, but I thought it was a horror book or horror adjacent because of the title, Valley of the Dolls. That's just where my mind went. But it's not a horror book. It's three young women who go to New York City and they want to find men to buy them furs. Really, that's where it starts. And it's gossipy, tabloid trash, and I loved it. I ate it all up. Very surprising. It's generally not the kind of book that I would read, but I'm very glad that I did. Another big surprise for me in 2023 was that I agreed with my mom. What? I did not see that coming. She was going on and on about this book that she read, that she loved, called Death Comes for the Archbishop. So immediately I'm thinking that it's a story about death coming to take out this religious figure, right? Which is surprising that my mom would enjoy that. She doesn't like horror. But that's not what the book is about. It's the story of a French priest who goes to the New World in mid-19th century to New Mexico, I believe. And he just helps people practice their faith. And it's the story of his life. Not at all the kind of book I would normally read, but my mom kept going on about it. And at the time, I was just reading a lot of horror for these video series I was making, like horror retrospectives of the 1970s, I believe, or 1980s. And I just needed a break. So I said, okay, I'm going to read something nice. My mom tells me this is nice. And it was. It was very nice. I was very impressed. The writing is beautiful. And this is a story about a priest going to the New World to help people practice their faith. And the writer, Willa Cather, she manages to tell the story with no preaching, no judgment or condemnation, a book about somebody's faith that manages to avoid all those trappings. I was very impressed, and I had a delightful time reading it, which was a surprise because normally the books that my mom loves do not find their way onto my TBR, but I'm glad that this one did. And lastly, another big surprise for me, which I experienced relatively recently, a few weeks ago, was Ancient Lights by Davis Grubb. I came upon this book researching horror books from the 1980s for the video retrospective. And Davis Grubb, apparently he had some success as a horror writer in the 50s, 60s, maybe 70s. And this book, which came out in 1983, was his last book. And it's not at all a horror book, not at all. It just got labeled horror on this list I was looking at because of the name Davis Grubb. So I started reading it and realized very early on that it's not a horror book. It doesn't fit the retrospective I was reading for. But the writing is so unique and beautiful and funny and clever that I had to keep going. It's like 500 pages, so I had to just put a pause on this retrospective and finish that book. And I was blown away. I had never read Davis Grubb before. I was familiar with the name because his first book was a big hit. His first book was Night of the Hunter from the mid-late 90s, or mid-late 50s, excuse me. So I knew the name, but I'd never read him. But now that I read Ancient Lights, I'm definitely going to go back, and I'm going to start with Night of the Hunter. I'll read that in January, definitely. That's high on my list. And he only wrote 11 books. Ancient Lights was his last one. So I'm thinking in 2024, I'll start off in January. I'll read Night of the Hunter. I expect I will love it. And then each month I will read another book from him, going chronologically through his catalog. Only 10 books. The Davis Grubb experiment. And you can join me if you'd like. I'm not committing to his entire catalog. If I go through a phase where I have a couple of bad experiences with his work, I'll abandon it. But I don't expect that to happen. I mean, Davis Grubb, based on Ancient Lights, I mean, he definitely knows what he's doing. He's a writer with good control of his craft, and I'm very curious to see what he put out. So that was a big surprise and a great discovery for me. Also, from that 1970s horror retrospective I had my first experience with John Saul, and it was very strange. I read his first book, Suffer the Children, and I enjoyed it, but it's so odd. The tone is just weird, and I want to read more from him. I want to see if that was an aberration or if he just has a strange mind. And so I'm going to read more John Saul. I'll probably do that very soon as well, because I'm currently in the middle of a 10-part retrospective of horror from the 1980s. So I will have an opportunity to read more from him, and I will take that opportunity because I am curious. Also, looking back at what I read in 2023, I see that I only read 3 short story compilations, which is probably not enough. So in 2024, I'm going to read more short story compilations. And I did, as part of this 80s retrospective, I did have my first experience with T.E.D. Klein in a book called The Ceremonies, which I really liked, and it was inventive. And apparently that book was based on one of his short stories. So I want to go back and read that short story and read other short stories of his. I've also recently had my first experience with Thomas Ligotti. I read his first short story compilation called Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and I was very impressed. And this is a recommendation from a viewer, so thank you. I was very impressed, and I'm going to read more from him in 2024. So there you have it, a few very pleasant surprises for me from 2023, and a few authors that I experienced for the first time that I definitely need to follow up on in 2024. If you made it this far and you're not a subscriber, go ahead and hit subscribe, and you can follow me on that journey as I continue to discover and follow up on these great authors that I'm happy that I discovered in 2023. Do you have any experience with the books I mentioned in this video or the authors? Would you be interested in following me on my Davis Grubb experiment in 2024? Let me know. I always look forward to hearing from you and from reading your comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.